Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Michael Neuder, and today I'll be presenting our paper, Defending Against Malicious Reorgs and Tezos Proof of Stake. And this work was done with my collaborators, Daniel Moroz, Rithvik and David Parks. So the contributions of the paper are as follows. We describe reorg attacks in Tezos, and we describe both selfish mining and double spend attacks. So the difference is, in selfish mining, the attacker earns more of the protocol prescribed rewards by following a dishonest policy. Whereas in a double spend attack, an attacker sends a transaction, receives a good from a counterparty, and later deletes the transaction, effectively robbing the counterparty. So typically double spend attacks take place over much longer reorg situations. We calculate the probability of these attacks based on the length of a reorg and the attacker strength. So varying these two parameters, we present kind of a general framework for calculating the probability. And we also examine how protocol modifications can impact these probabilities of attacks. And in particular, we demonstrate that protocol parameters that protect against selfish mining actually leave the network vulnerable to double spend attacks and vice versa. Finally, we present a method to detect potentially vulnerable chain states. And we do this in the paper, though it won't be presented today based on timing constraints, but do definitely check out the paper if you're interested. So a note on related work, the inspiration really comes from the original selfish mining literature originated by Eyal and Gunzer in 2013. And this work was extended to demonstrate theoretical weaknesses in longest chain proof of stake by Brown-Cohen et al. In 2019. And we instantiate two types of these attacks in Tezos, the predictable selfish mine and the predictable double spend, which I mentioned in the previous slide. We're also extending a previous paper of our own, where we examine specifically length 2 malicious reorgs, which can be used to accomplish selfish mining in Tezos. So we generalize this to kind of an arbitrary length attack. Finally, we work kind of in parallel to the Nomadic Labs team, which is the group that implements most of the software for the Tezos blockchain. And they have a blog post exploring similar questions, but using a different methodology. So a bit about Tezos proof of stake. There's two roles that stakers play in the block creation process. There's bakers, who are analogous to miners in proof of work. So they collect transactions and publish blocks, and endorsers. Endorsers are responsible for cryptographically signing the best block that they hear at a given block height. So at each block height, there's kind of two data structures that are created. First, an ordered list of eligible bakers. And the reason I call it ordered is because the 0th baker, baker 0, will kind of have the first shot at creating a block. If for whatever reason they don't create a block, either they're offline or behaving maliciously, then baker 1 will have an opportunity and so forth. The other data structure is a list of 32 endorsers. And this is unordered, meaning each endorser has the same weight. And they are in charge of basically signing the first block at a specific block height that they hear. Or at least that's what the honest protocol dictates. So now we can explore how block creation process occurs. We have a block at slot L. We talk about things in terms of slots or block heights. So this is just the Lth block after the genesis. As some time passes, a number of endorsements for this block come in saying, hey, this is, we think this is the head of the current chain. And the subsequent block, the block at L+1, includes the previous slot endorsements. And since endorsements are just operations that are heard over the network, including them is the same as including any other transaction. And we see that there's two state variables that kind of dictate how fast this block can be created. And the first is the priority. Priority is the index of the baker who created the block in the baker list. So since this is priority 0, it was baked by baker 0 in our baker list. The second is the number of endorsements that the block includes. So in this case, they include E0 through E30. So that's 31 of the 32 possible endorsements. And the reason these numbers matter is because they parameterize this delay function, where P is priority, E is number of endorsements. And what the delay function dictates is, in order for the block L+1 to be considered valid, the timestamp of the block must differ from the previous block's timestamp by at least d seconds. And this is kind of a complicated looking equation, but the simplified version of it is if P is equal to 0, so the highest priority baker, and they include at least 24 of the 32 possible endorsements, then the delay will be 60 seconds. So a block L plus 1 could be created 60 seconds after block L and would still be considered valid by all the honest nodes. Lastly, baking and endorsing rights are randomly allocated proportionally to the amount of stake owned. So this is similar to how in proof of work, the higher amount of the higher percentage of the hash power that a miner owns, the higher the probability that they have to mine the next block. And the difference is, in this case, the bakers and endorsers are known very far in advance. So in Tezos proof of stake, for example, about several thousand blocks into the future, it's completely known who will be baking and endorsing. And this is much different from proof of work, where we don't even know a single block into the future who's going to mine the next block. And what this allows, especially for double spends, is the attacker to look into the future, see when an attack is feasible, and line up a transaction to perfectly correspond to the time when they'll be executing a malicious reorg. So this comes to one of the main points of the paper, and that is calculating the probabilities of these malicious reorgs caused by attacker private forks. So that's kind of schematized in this figure here. So we see that it has slot L through slot L plus N. So this is N plus 1 slots. And the golden block here on the left is going to represent the starting point of the attacker fork. And these green blocks along the top row here are N minus 1 honest blocks. So this is kind of what everyone's going to see is the canonical fork, and everyone's going to agree that this is the current head of the chain at this slot. Now we say a length N minus 1 reorg is feasible for the attacker if they can reach the slot L plus N with their private fork here, represented by the red blocks on the bottom row, faster than the honest network can. So in this case, it's kind of a race to this slot. And if the attacker can win, then they keep this fork private until the honest chain reaches slot L plus N minus 1. And then they release this fork, which is longer than this, will be accepted based on the fork choice rule, and thus effectively erasing these blocks. So because of predictability, the attacker knows when this is possible and can execute a transaction between these slots, so between slot L and slot L plus 1, and then wait N minus 1 blocks before reorging the chain and deleting the transaction. So this is what we describe as like a N minus 1 confirmation double spend. And the rate of block creation for each of these forks is governed by the P and E, which parameterize the delay function. So we describe P and E in terms of 3 random variables: HI, which is the highest priority amongst honest bakers for a given slot; AI, which is the highest priority of the attacker at a given slot; and EI, which is the number of endorsements owned by the attacker. So for each slot, we have these 3 random variables that are not independent, and these together create the random process that we study. And in particular, we are interested in the question of, for a given attacker stake, how probable is it that they can execute this reorg for an arbitrary N? So now we can look at some of the numerical results from this calculation, and we use Monte Carlo and importance sampling methods to calculate the probability of reorgs as a function of attacker stake. So here's some numerical results for length 35 reorg. And on the x-axis, we have the attacker stake approaching 0.5, which is kind of the security threshold. And on the y-axis, we have the probability of a feasible attack. And it's worth noting that this axis is in log scale. So as the attacker stake increases, the probability of a feasible attack grows, not quite exponentially, because that would be a line on this graph, but at least quite super linearly. And now we can see that for different length attacks, the probabilities kind of shift left or right depending on if the attack length is increasing or decreasing. So here we show for length 20, 35, 55, and 80 what the probabilities are. And these confidence intervals, which are represented by the red error bars, are 99% Clopper-Pearson and importance sampling intervals. So now we can think about protocol modifications. And if we look back at our delay function, we can kind of think about a more general version of the delay function with the three following parameters that we can tune. dp, which is the time penalty for each drop in Baker priority. de, the time penalty for each missing attestation past some threshold ei. And ei being that threshold, which indicates the number of endorsements needed to avoid any missing endorsement penalties. So for Tezos, the current implementation is 48 and 24, but it's kind of an interesting question to see for different values of these parameters, how do the probabilities of deep reorgs and selfish mining change? So now we can kind of generalize. So let lambda equal this tuple dp, de, and ei. And then we can define an objective function g, parameterized by beta, which represents a weighted average of the probability of a selfish mine and a probability of a deep reorg, both conditioned on the lambda protocol parameters. So ideally, an objective function would not only minimize the probability of a selfish mine, but also of a deep reorg. And indeed, when we consider the case where beta equals 1/2, then we just obtain the average of the two probabilities. And thus, in order to minimize the objective function, we need to minimize the average of the two probabilities. So with this, we can now examine this figure here. And what's going on here is we fix the delay priority equal to 40. And this is what's described in the current Tezos implementation. And then we can vary DE and EI. So in this case, DE is varied from 4 to 20 and EI is varied from 0 to 32. And for each of these values, we can evaluate G. And the color of each cell represents the value of G for that pair. And the color bar here indicates the kind of range of values that we see. So low values, so the darker black and purple regions, are considered good because they do a good job of minimizing the average probability of the selfish mine and the deep reorg. Whereas yellow values are high, bad. So one nice thing, by slicing along this axis where dp equals 40, we can see exactly where the current Tezos implementation lies in this like G landscape, basically. And we see that this is represented by the yellow, or by this blue cell here. And it's kind of at the edge of this valley, but not necessarily at the lowest point. So it's not necessarily optimal for this objective function G. And another interesting feature is that this is a nonlinear surface, right? So it starts high on the left, goes down into a valley, and then kind of starts to creep back up on the right. So you can't just choose the protocol parameters all the way onto one extrema because this isn't actually a linear function. And now we can think about doing this for the other values of these protocol parameters. So in each of these three cases, we fix the specific protocol parameter to what it is in the Tezos implementation, and then explore the other parameters and display the surface created by the value of G at each of those pairs. So we can see that in each of these three cases, the Tezos implementation kind of lies somewhere on the boundary of this deep, dark region here. And this means it's kind of close to being as good as low as it could be, but not quite optimal for this specific G function. So now another thing we can think about is using beta to actually weight the probabilities of selfish mining and deep reorging in different ways. So we can vary beta to prioritize one over the other. So if we imagine a case where beta equals 0, then we only are thinking about minimizing the probability of a selfish mine. Whereas if beta equals 1, we're only caring about the probability of a deep reorg. And this figure here shows that the landscape of G actually changes dramatically as we adjust our value of beta. So the top shows beta equals 0, middle is beta equals 0.7, and bottom is beta equals 1. We see that the landscape completely shifts from high on the left, low on the right, to kind of a valley, which is high on both sides and low in the middle, to high on the right and low on the left. And the point of the kind of takeaway here is that if we were optimizing just for selfish mining, we could conceivably choose something in the bottom right corner because that seems like a really dark location. But in fact, that would leave us extremely vulnerable to deep reorgs. And this demonstrates a trade-off between optimizing your protocol for selfish mining versus deep reorgs. And another way to think about this is as 3D surfaces, where the height is determined by the value and thus the color of the cell. So we see how dramatically the landscape shifts as we change beta. So that's all I had for today. This is a summary of what I spoke about. Again, I didn't get to talk about the detection metric, but please do check out the paper for information on that. And a bit about future work. It's easy to consider extending this to other proof of stake protocols, and that's very interesting. Additionally, ensemble attacks, which combine this with network level attacks, are shown to be really effective in proof of work, so likely similar in proof of stake. And finally, alternative delay functions, which consider different functional forms for how to consider block validity. So that's all I have, and thank you very much.